Well, now the State of the Union, Associate Professor of National Security at the University of New Haven, Matthew Schmidt, will join us in a moment to talk about Biden's address and, in particular, Ukraine. But first, to CNN's Christy Lustau, live for us this hour in Hong Kong. And Christy, President Biden seems to believe offence may be the best defence when it comes to domestic criticism over the time it took to shoot down that balloon, that Chinese balloon. But how will that go down in Beijing?
Yeah, you know, John, we're still awaiting official Chinese reaction to the State of the Union, but it's interesting. CNN learned that China was mentioned in the original text of the State of the Union address well before the Chinese balloon slipped into American airspace last week, which, of course, caused that major political uproar and prompted the U.S. Secretary of State to cancel that planned visit to Beijing. And on top of that, it also added this new sense of urgency to the U.S. president's messaging about competition with China. Let's take a listen.
I'm committed to work with China where we can advance American interests and benefit the world. But make no mistake about it, as we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did.
Now, since the U.S. military shot down the Chinese balloon, China has been hardening its rhetoric significantly. In fact, we've learned that the charge d'affaires of China, its top official in Washington, D.C., has overnight lodged representations, stern representations against officials at the U.S. State Department, also at the White House National Security Council. We also learned that the Pentagon is saying that when it made a request after it shot down the Chinese balloon, it made a request for its U.S. Secretary of Defense to speak to his Chinese counterpart immediately after a U.S. fighter jet shot down the balloon. That offer was declined by the Chinese. And then there's also this, what we heard from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Tuesday, the spokeswoman saying, look, the United States right now in the process of recovering the remnants, the debris of the balloon, analyzing it. But even the debris belongs to China. Let's bring up the statement. This, according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman Mao Ning, who said the airship is China's. It's not the U.S.'s. The United States should have handled it properly in a calm, professional, non-forceful manner. But its insistence on using force is a clear overreaction. Again, that use of overreaction from Beijing in regards to the U.S. shooting down the Chinese balloon. Again, China insists that the balloon was a civilian vessel that somehow blew off course. But the United States maintains that it was used for spycraft. In fact, U.S. intelligence officials have told CNN that it was part of a broader military surveillance operation. Back to you, John.
Lots of balloons. Christy Luke's out there, live for us in Hong Kong. Let's go to Matthew Schmidt now for the Ukraine part of the State of the Union. So, Matthew, Ukraine was kind of buried towards the end of Biden's address. And he said Putin's war was a test for the world and a test for America. Here's a little more from Joe Biden. Listen to this.
Would we stand for the most basic of principles? Would we stand for sovereignty? We stand for the right of people to live free of tyranny? Would we stand for the defense of democracy? For such defense matters to us because it keeps peace and prevents open season on would-be aggressors and threatens our prosperity. 1 year later, we know the answer. Yes, we would, and we did. We did.
This was sort of a moment of, look, we kept our promise, everything's great, but you have support for Ukraine and the U.S. Military assistance and other financial aid going there, dropping among Republicans. Was this a missed opportunity for Biden to explain why Putin is a threat to U.S. national security and why U.S. support is critical?
No, I think that the American public knows that argument and may be a little tired of it right now. What they wanted to see tonight, to the extent that anybody was watching, honestly, was a president who was focused on domestic problems, a president who was focused on their problems, which is why when he did bring up Putin, he brought up Putin juxtaposed against big pharma and drug prices. And when he brought up Ukraine, he brought up American policy in Ukraine, not just in terms of American values and supporting those in Ukraine, but in terms of breaking inflation, in terms of it being in our economic interest to support Ukraine.
OK, so let's look at some of the polls, though, because there's a lot of them out right now. A lot of polls have been released. And there's a common thread. They show this growing partisan divide across the United States when it comes to American support for Ukraine. Gallup found 47% of Republicans say the U.S. is doing too much. 48% of Democrats believe it's about right. An NBC News poll, 63% of Republicans opposed to providing more funding and weapons to Ukraine, while 32% were in support. Pew Research also found an increase in Democrat opposition to supporting Ukraine, up from 10 to 15%. But for the most part, it's Republican support which seems to be eroding. So what's driving that? Because Ukraine was once a bipartisan issue.
Well, the Republican Party, or at least branches of the Republican Party, are driving that message on purpose. This is something that they see as a wedge issue against not just Biden, but against Democrats, in the upcoming election. And so they're going to use this any way they can to gain seats. One of the things that the rest of the world needs to remember about the United States is we don't have a national election. We have 435 local elections. And so just because you see those numbers where 63% of the population's support for Ukraine is going down, that matters less than what it is in a particular district in Pennsylvania.
Well, there's no hesitation when it comes to support from Europe, in particular Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands. They're sending at least 100 Leopard 1 tanks to Ukraine. These are the older model ones, commissioned back in 1965. They should arrive in the next few months. So how do these tanks stack up against the old Russian tanks?
Well, I think people misunderstand how these tanks are going to be used. The top line tanks are going to be sort of out front protecting the second tier tanks. And what really matters is in the rear, you have all of these armored personnel carriers and up-armored Humvees and these kinds of things. You don't need a tank to kill a tank. So all of these vehicles are going to have mounted on them anti-tank weapons, and they're going to be carrying in infantry to try to break through and get behind Russian lines, to get past that defensive line. So this isn't going to be tank on tank. So those kind of comparisons really sort of miss the point.
Well, then, in the larger point, though, here, will these tanks do the job, I guess, is the question.
I think that they can when you match them up with these other weapon systems. And I think the most important thing is with the combined arms maneuver training that's been going on in Germany and other places. If Ukraine can operate units of 500 personnel with these kinds of weapon systems in unison with each other, they're going to make a lot of gains on the battlefield.
Matthew, thank you for being up late for us. We really appreciate that. Thank you.
My pleasure, John.